Good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Levinson. On behalf of the Senior Center here at Central, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. Our focus today is a Halloween-themed program that will include a guided tour of hell. And our guest will also explain how human ideas about Satan and hell have evolved over the last 3,000 years. Joining us today is Dr. Scott Bruce of Fordham University. I'll be introducing him in just a few minutes, but before I do, there's several points I want to touch on briefly. First, I want to tell you that on Wednesday, November 1st, the distinguished presidential historian, Richard Norton Smith, will be here. No living historian knows America's presidents or the institution of the presidency as well as Dr. Smith. He's also known for being a candid, honest, engaging, and very entertaining guest. So I'm looking forward to interviewing him. I'm hoping you'll be able to join us. A quick reminder now that you can shoot a question to today's guest at any time during the program this morning. Just look for the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That will enable you to type a question to him. Scott is happy to respond to any and all questions and will at the end of his presentation this morning. Now, here are some things you should know about him. He is a professor of medieval studies at Fordham University in the Bronx. More specifically, he focuses on Christianity during the Middle Ages. Scott is Canadian by birth. He worked his way through college as a gravedigger. What could be more appropriate for a Halloween-themed program than that? Scott has long been interested in the foundations of modern Christianity and how they were established. Working in partnership with Penguin Classics, he has published 3 important and extremely entertaining anthologies. They include the Penguin Book of the Undead, the Penguin Book of Hell, and the Penguin Book of Dragons. Most recently, Scott has been focused on Greek Christian documents. Now, some of these survive because they were translated into Latin. And Scott has received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to help him move forward on this important project. And so it is my genuine pleasure to turn the program over to him.
Well, thank you very much, Dick. I'm going to share my screen right now. I'm so grateful for the invitation and so grateful to be here to talk to you today. Whoops-a-daisy. Sorry. Oh, sorry, excuse me 1 second. I'm deeper into my slides than I thought I was. All right. I hope everybody can hear me. And welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time out this morning to listen to this talk. And I look forward to fielding questions when I'm done. Thank you. So in March of 2018, Pope Francis allegedly denied the existence of hell and the endless suffering of the damned in a private talk with his long-standing friend, Eugenio Scalfari, a left-wing journalist who published his account of their conversation in the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. The response to Scalfari's article was immediate and explosive. How could the Pope deny such a fundamental teaching of the Church? The Christian tradition is clear on the doctrine. God created hell for Satan and the rebel angels, but there was plenty of room to torture with fire and brimstone everyone who had rejected Jesus Christ as the Son of God. As according to the book of Revelations, this is the second death, the lake of fire. If true, Francis's doubts about the existence of hell follow hard on the heels of the reorganization of the afterlife begun with much less fanfare by his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, who in 2007 quietly abolished the concept of limbo the otherworldly destination of babies who died before their baptism. The report of the Vatican Theological Commission on Limbo was hopeful that God would in fact save unbaptized babies rather than have them linger for eternity on the threshold of hell, as Catholics had believed for centuries. The shuddering of limbo was a victory for those who believed that God's mercy and love should trump his terrible judgment. Is it time then for the Catholic Church to foreclose on hell as well? By any measure, hell is a cruel and oppressive concept, a place where sinners suffer unspeakable torments for all eternity for sins committed during their mortal lives. It has a long history that predates Christianity by more than a millennium. Many ancient societies in the Near East told stories about the fate of souls after death that hinted at the terrible judgments awaiting the unjust in the afterlife. Early Christians appropriated this literature of suffering, composing harrowing stories of human souls escorted by angels to witness the torture of those imprisoned in the infernal depths. By the European Middle Ages, hell was a cornerstone of Christian doctrine. Parish priests preached sermons about terrible torments awaiting sinners. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that the blessed in heaven rejoiced at the sight of the suffering of the damned. And Dante Alighieri composed his towering poem, The Divine Comedy, which depicted hell as an efficient bureaucracy shaped like a descending funnel, with Satan trapped in ice at the very bottom. The Protestant Reformation did little to slow hell's advance. It was only in the 19th century that belief in the eternal punishment of the damned lost ground as a concept contrary to God's mercy. Staunch Catholics fought back, however, with fervent religious tracts, like John Furness's The Sight of Hell from 1875, a morbid little treatise on infernal torment written specifically for children. We'll return to this work later in the talk. But the tide was finally turning. Hell's tenacity in the Western tradition lies first and foremost in its oppressive power. For centuries, the Catholic Church deployed vivid tableaus of the suffering of lost souls in nightmarish landscapes to keep ordinary Christians in line. It was believed that the fear of hell peopled heaven. But the concept of hell also plays a vital cathartic function in societies rife with injustice, because it provides us with the grim satisfaction that tyrannical leaders, corrupt priests, and other evildoers protected in this life by their wealth or the dignity of their station will not escape God's judgment in the world to come. As the Book of Wisdom says, the mighty will be mightily tormented. Thus, despite hell's retreat in modern times, it remains a powerful concept in the early 21st century. More than 50% of American adults still believe in the existence of a place where people who have led bad lives and die without being sorry are eternally punished. Unsurprisingly, very few of them believe that they will end up there themselves when they die. But hell's enduring legacy is even more insidious. For 2 millennia, Christians have imagined hell as a subterranean realm where divine judgment meted out eternal punishment on the wicked. But in the 20th century, it became a dominant metaphor for suffering and squalor here on earth. The modern world has internalized hell as a state of mind, transforming it from a passive metaphor to an active inspiration for how to treat other people. With killing technologies, we give hell to our enemies and to the innocent. From the Jews at the death camps of Treblinka to the Japanese civilians of Hiroshima, from the inmates crowding our prisons to the refugees amassing at our borders. By creating hell for our fellow human beings in this life, have we unwittingly usurped God's judgment as our own, only to become the tormenting demons that our ancestors feared? Has hell outlived its usefulness to modern society? Probably not. The doctrine still serves the Catholic Church, as it has for centuries, as a frightening deterrent to sinful behavior. Moreover, the grave injustices in our country assure that the concept of hell will remain useful, if only in our hope that wicked people and corrupt leaders will get their just deserts in the world to come. In some far-flung better future, the foreclosure of hell will be an important step in the maturation of human societies into places that can mete out justice on their own without supernatural aid. In the meantime, hell is here to stay. Will Pope Francis evict the devil and his minions and liberate the numberless tortured souls clawing at the walls of their burning cells? Don't count on it. There isn't a hope in hell, so it's said. So it's imperative that we understand the origins and the influence of this concept of the afterlife, from its beginnings in antiquity until the dawn of the modern era. This is our task this morning, and it's a big one. We start in the ancient world. Under the pitiless skies of the ancient world, human beings held out hope that their mortal lives were not the sum of their entire existence. But the prospects for the afterlife were usually grim. In the early civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, most people who survived to adulthood toiled as subsistence farmers, whose lives were foreclosed at an early age by injury, illness, and childbirth. The threat of death haunted their every step. For the ancient Mesopotamians, individual souls were not singled out for punishment in the other world. The end of life brought the same bleak fate to everyone, irrespective of their station in society. Upon death, souls entered the world of no return, where they resided below the ground as insubstantial shadows in a house of dust. It's no wonder then that their ancient myths betrayed an urgency for the defeat of this loathsome kind of death. In the earliest surviving work of human literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 BCE, a Mesopotamian king undertook a perilous voyage to discover the secret of immortality, to escape the fate of all mortals, only to learn that it was unattainable, for only the gods live forever. For their part, the ancient Egyptians nurtured a less somber view of the afterlife than their Mesopotamian neighbors. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, they held the firm belief that the realm of the dead was open to all people. Unlike other ancient cultures, however, they believed that a person's experience in the next life was intimately bound up with his or her conduct in this one. Egyptians who lived in accordance with ma'at, an ethical disposition characterized by kindness and justice, could expect to enter the bountiful halls of Osiris. And here in this image, we have this is a depiction from the Book of the Dead of the fate of a soul of a man named Hunefer. And you can see him on the left-hand side being led by Anubis to the scales where his heart, which is represented in that little jar there on the left-hand side of the scale, is being weighed against Ma'at, which is represented by a feather. And since it goes well for him, he's led into the halls of Osiris on the far right-hand side. Good for him. In contrast, those whose consciences betrayed them when the death god Anubis weighed their hearts against the feather, the symbol of Ma'at, faced a terrifying second death. Flame-faced spirits waited to hack them asunder and cast them into pits of fire. Ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions about the afterlife did not carry the same weight in Western culture as the stories told around the Mediterranean rim by the Greeks and later by the Romans. There was no ethical judgment of ordinary souls in the Greek underworld. The spirits of human beings inhabited the grim abode of Hades as listless shades, stripped of every remnant of their former selves except for the sad memories of the lives they once lived. When the hero Odysseus visited the House of Death, an episode recounted in Homer's Odyssey, the ghost of the mighty warrior Achilles warned him that the afterlife was a pitiful state of existence. Quote, "No winning words about death to me, shining Odysseus. By God, I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt poor tenant farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead." As depicted by Homer and other ancient poets, the Greek underworld was a gloomy realm inhabited not only by the shades of the departed, but also by mythological monsters, like the three-headed dog Cerberus, who prevented the dead from leaving the kingdom of Hades. The deepest and darkest section of the Greco-Roman underworld was called Tartarus. In Homer's time, it served as a prison for the rebellious Titans and a place of torment for mythical figures like Tityos, Tantalus, and Sisyphus, who merited eternal punishments for their affronts to the gods. A few centuries later, however, a democratization of the punitive afterlife had begun. Around 400 BCE, the philosopher Socrates and his interlocutors could imagine a fate in which the souls of the dead endured pain for the crimes they committed in their former lives. Later still, In the early days of the Roman Republic, we find the poet Virgil depicting the underworld as a place where ordinary people could expect to suffer tortures for a litany of offenses. He singled out those who sowed discord in their families, perpetrated fraud, hoarded wealth, killed for adultery, committed treason, and broke oaths. Quote, all of them walled up here, wait to meet their doom. Virgil's poem, the Aeneid, became the most formative and widely read source of ancient pagan beliefs about the underworld in the Western tradition, shaping all subsequent accounts of the punitive afterlife in the Christian era. The earliest Christian authors inherited from the Greeks and the Romans the notion that the souls of the dead lived in a realm beneath the earth or on a distant shore, this is Hades, where particularly wicked individuals suffered eternal punishments, as they did in Tartarus. But the holy writings of the ancient Israelites exerted an equally powerful influence on Christian conceptions of the punitive afterlife. In contrast to Greek and Roman literature, the Hebrew scripture offered no stories of heroes who descended to the underworld. There was no Jewish Odysseus or Orpheus or Aeneas. Unlike other ancient religions, Judaism forbade commerce with the dead by means of necromancy, emphasized the living believer's relationship to God, and did not speculate at length about the fate of the soul after death. Nonetheless, the earliest Christians inherited two Hebrew words for the afterlife that shaped the way that they formulated their nascent conception of hell: Sheol and Gehenna. The term Sheol, the underworld, appeared many times in the Hebrew scriptures. Similar to the concept of Hades among the Greeks, Sheol was a place of darkness where souls abided in silence and forgetfulness. Hebrew prophets described it as a prison of sorts with gates and bars. Sheol was generally reserved for wicked and impious individuals, but it was not a place of otherworldly torture. To express their idea of a punitive afterlife, early Christians repurposed the word Gehenna. The name derived from the Hebrew Gehinnom, Valley of Hinnom, a site on the southern side of the city of Jerusalem where the Israelites had once sacrificed their children in fire to the Canaanite god Molech. For this idolatry, God sent the Babylonians to punish them and led them into exile for 70 years, the so-called Babylonian captivity, which lasted from 598 to 538 BCE. Upon their return, the Israelites treated the Valley of Hinnom as an accursed place, where rebels against God would be punished. Quote, and they shall go forth and look on the dead bodies of the men that have rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. Those are the words of Isaiah in Isaiah 66. The earliest Christians adopted the word Gehenna as the equivalent of Tartarus, the destination of the wicked who merited punishment after death for their sins. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus issued this warning to his disciples, couched in the language of the prophet Isaiah. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than with two eyes to be thrown into Gehenna, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. That's Mark 9. Wedding the pagan notion of a punitive afterlife for those who offended the divine with the imagery of the fire and the worm from the Hebrew scriptures, early Christian authors imagined a host of otherworldly punishments that inspired theologians, artists, and poets throughout the European Middle Ages and beyond. In the late 1st century, the author of the book of Revelation foretold how the armies of Gog and Magog assembled against the saints would be consumed by fire from heaven. And the devil, I'm quoting Revelations 20, and the devil who had deceived them would be thrown into a lake of fire and brimstone where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. No description of hell's topography and the tortures practiced there was more popular in medieval Europe than the so-called Apocalypse of Paul, an anonymous work of the late 4th century. This text purported to describe a vision of heaven and hell experienced by the Apostle Paul, who spread the message of Christ to the Greeks and the Romans in the 1st century. Allegedly discovered alongside the apostle's shoes in a marble box hidden in the foundation of his house in Tarsus, the Apocalypse of Paul revealed for Christian readers a nightmarish landscape of molten rivers where angels of Tartarus oversaw the punishment of men and women, each torture tailored for their specific sins. Singled out for suffering were church officials, bishops, deacons, and so on, who had failed to fulfill the duties of their office. While fire was the dominant form of punishment in Paul's vision, many sinners were also eaten alive by gnawing worms, disemboweled by hellish angels, plunged into deep pits, and tormented by extreme cold. This apocryphal text was not accepted into the canon of the Christian scriptures, but this did not prevent it from circulating widely in the Middle Ages. Equally popular in the early Christian tradition was the legend of Christ's descent into hell during the 3 days between his death on Good Friday and his resurrection from the tomb on Easter Sunday. But like the Apocalypse of Paul, it was never recognized as part of the authoritative canon of the New Testament. Attributed to a sympathetic Pharisee named Nicodemus, who visited Jesus during his ministry, and this we see in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, and later helped Joseph of Arimathea prepare his body for burial in John 19, the legend was most likely composed in Greek many centuries after the death of Christ, but it circulated widely in Latin as part of a story cycle known as the Gospel of Nicodemus. This apocryphal gospel recounted Christ's dramatic trial before Pontius Pilate and the machinations of the Jewish high priests who sought to humiliate and execute Jesus. It concluded with the harrowing of hell, being an account of Christ's rescue of Adam, Eve, and the Old Testament patriarchs and prophets from the other world, and the defeat of Satan and death by his sacrifice on the cross. In this work, so the illumination I'm showing you here, which is from the 12th century, presents the Adam and Eve and the other Jewish patriarchs being let out of a hell mouth, with Satan bound up, Christ's staff with the cross on top in Satan's mouth. But see, you can see the chains on Satan's paws there, and Christ is trampling Satan. He's visibly right on top of him. Here, the artist is eliding a whole narrative that has Christ trampling the doors of hell and shackling the devil and freeing the patriarchs from hell. But in the Middle Ages, hell was almost always depicted as a giant monstrous mouth. We'll come back to some images of this soon. So in this work, the underworld was a holding pen for the righteous Jewish patriarchs who foretold the coming of Christ and through their faith avoided punishment in the afterlife. This subterranean realm was under the dominion of Inferus, a personification of hell who ruled over a host of impious minions in a featureless kingdom protected by impenetrable gates of bronze. Christ trampled those gates to free the righteous dead, emptied the so-called limbo of the patriarchs, and left Satan bound in solitary confinement as the last prisoner of hell until the day of judgment. Early medieval Christians inherited from pagan and Jewish traditions a firm understanding of hell as a place where impious souls suffered after death, but they wrestled with the notion of where it was located. During the so-called Dark Ages of European history, and here I'll say 500 to 700 CE, although we don't like to use the term Dark Ages, monastic authors depicted the location and features of hell in stories about visions of the other world. In these stories, the souls of ailing monks made journeys to the afterlife to witness the horrors of hell and the pleasures of heaven, before returning to tell their tales to the living to encourage the cultivation of virtue and the avoidance of sin. The depiction of hell in these stories was complicated by the fact that Christian thinkers like Pope Gregory the Great or the Venerable Bede were also formulating the earliest ideas about purgatory, a place between heaven and hell, where the souls of the sinful dead suffered in fire to purge them of their sins before they entered heaven. The introduction of the concept of purgatory had a strong influence on depictions of hell in the early Middle Ages. Whereas souls in purgatory had every hope of entering heaven once their painful cleansing by fire was complete, the wicked bound for hell would never escape the punishments awaiting them there. Their suffering lasted for eternity. As a result, early medieval visions of the afterlife tended to focus on the transient torments of sinful souls preparing for entry into heaven, and only brought the reader to the lip of hell's abyss without venturing any further. Perhaps because the horrors awaiting unrepentant sinners were not as useful for encouraging moral reform of individuals as the pains of purgatory, or perhaps because they were simply too terrible to contemplate. The Venerable Bede monk of the Abbey of Wearmouth Yarrow in Northumbria, provided two accounts of otherworldly journeys in his ecclesiastical history of the English people. It was actually, it says here in the slides, 735, but that's actually Bede's death. It was written 731. Forgive my mistake there. The first of these concerned a monk named Fursa. After falling into a trance due to an illness, this ascetic experienced a vision of hell featuring a dark valley and 4 balls of fire that floated in the air, each one representing a particular sin. Angels and demons battled with each other to lay hold of his soul. This is an 11th century illumination in a manuscript. This is the Newminster Liber Vitae. I show it to you right now to show the fate of one such soul like Fursa. This doesn't represent the Fursa story, but note how in that top register, the little tunicked soul is being grabbed on either side, one side by an angel who has an accompanying buddy who has a book that presumably has all of the virtues of this soul written in it, and the other side by a devil who's trying to drag the soul away, holding his own book recording the soul's sins. As you can see, the two rather sad souls in the top register on the right are ones that are being led off, and the lower panel shows the ultimate fate of those souls, locked away by the archangel in hell, and then descending into the hellmouth, from which they will not return. So, Fursa, although he was protected by angelic escorts, Fursa received burns from the scorching soul of a sinner that he had known in life. And if I'm remembering the text correctly, a demon actually throws this burning, suffering soul at Fursa and burns him. Much to his surprise, upon his return to his own body, Fursa discovered that he bore scars where the hellfire had touched him. These scars served not only as proof of his story, that it was true, but also as a painful reminder of the fate in store for sinners in the afterlife. The second otherworldly journey related by the Venerable Bede concerned a monk named Drythelm, whose soul journeyed far from his body to witness a variety of sufferings that the dead endured to prepare them for God's final judgment. Drythelm's experience unmasked the ambiguous topography of the afterlife in medieval thought. As the monk watched souls being tormented in turns by scorching heat and painful cold, he wondered if he was looking upon hell, only to be told by his angelic guide that he was not. Only later did he venture further on to a shadowy place infested with demons, where jets of flame filled with doomed souls spouted over a dark pit. This was hell. In the newly converted territories of the Anglo-Saxons, Drythelm's vision of the fire-spitting abyss sounded a dire warning. Only those believers who embraced the Christian faith with a true change of heart and a contempt for this world would experience God's abiding presence in heaven. The rest could anticipate an eternity of excruciating torment in demonic company. Well, in contrast to Bede's stories about subterranean landscapes of frost and fire, the near contemporary Voyage of St. Brendan offered a depiction of hell on the open ocean. The episodes I'm going to tell you about right now, to my knowledge, are not illuminated in the medieval tradition. Here instead is a lovely picture of Brendan and his colleagues. This is probably the most famous episode from the Voyage of St. Brendan, where they land on an island and they start a fire only to discover that the island is a whale, which they've disturbed. It's a nice bit of solace amidst all this other imagery we're looking at. So in this story, a legendary Irish saint named Brendan set sail with 16 of his companions in search of the promised land of the saints. Venturing on uncharted seas, they encountered strange islands and monstrous creatures. Toward the end of the voyage, Brendan's ship ventured close to the outskirts of hell, where the saint and his companions, had 3 fateful encounters. They discovered an island inhabited by hostile fire giants, reminiscent of the Cyclops in Homer's Odyssey, who hurled molten slag at their ship. They skirted an enormous mountain with a smoking summit where demons carried off one of their crew. And they conversed with Judas Iscariot, who was taking a rare reprieve from his torments on a storm-tossed crag in the open sea. Brendan's journey by sea to this unconventional otherworld evoked the ancient Homeric tradition, which located the entrance to Hades on a dark and distant shore. By the 12th century, the contours of hell came into clearer focus. Written in 1149, the Vision of Tundel is without doubt the most graphic and horrifying tour of the netherworld, composed before Dante's Inferno in the 14th century, but it remains little known among modern readers. This tableau of hell differs from its late antique and early medieval predecessors in a number of important ways. First and foremost, the main character, an Irish knight named Tundel, was a sinner. This is a much later, this is a 15th century illuminated manuscript owned by the Getty in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, but it illustrates very nicely here poor little naked Tundel and his angelic companion as they wander through the landscape of hell. Unlike the monks who populated earlier visions of the other world, as Tundel is conducted through hell by an angel, he's also forced to submit to the cruel torments that he witnesses as a reminder to avoid sinful behavior when his soul is later reunited with his body. Second, the author depicted the topography of hell with unprecedented attention to texture and detail. The infernal regions are a vast landscape of towering peaks, dark valleys, fetid swamps, and bottomless pits, traversed by roads and bridges and inhabited by demons, monstrous creatures, and menacing characters like the hellish innkeeper, Fristinus. Likewise, the torments described in this text are especially lurid and visceral. Here's an example of the punishment awaiting monks and nuns who lied to God in thought and deed. Quote, "And the angel led the way. They saw a beast very different from all the other beasts they had previously seen. It had 2 feet and 2 wings, a very long neck, and an iron beak. It even had iron claws, and from its mouth it vomited a relentless flame. This beast sat in a swamp that was frozen over with ice, where it devoured any souls it could find. While they were in its stomach, these souls were reduced to nothing as their punishment. The beast then regurgitated them onto the surface of the frozen swamp, where their torments were renewed once again." Third, when Tundel plumbed the deepest pit of hell, he glimpsed Satan himself, a monster of unrivaled size bound in eternal torment to a fiery grill. No other text from this period described the Prince of Hell so vividly, or presented him in the throes of agony, forever punished in the act of dispensing punishment to others. While scholars are quick to characterize the Vision of Tundel as a precursor to Dante's Inferno, it stands on its own as the most fully realized, and therefore the most terrifying, vision of hell produced in medieval Europe. Its lurid imagery captured the popular imagination, spawning translations in numerous languages and inspiring nightmarish paintings of the afterlife by the Dutch master Hieronymus Bosch and his many imitators. Well, written in the early 14th century, the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri is unrivaled in the Western tradition in its depiction of the horrors of hell. This long Italian poem told the story of the author's journey to the 3 domains of the dead, beginning with his descent to the place of eternal torment, the Inferno. Escorted through hell by the shade of the Roman poet Virgil, whose depiction of Hades in his epic poem, the Aeneid, did much to inspire the first part of the Divine Comedy, Dante painted a vivid tableau of the hideous fates awaiting the wicked in a vast subterranean realm where divine justice doled out punishment to sinners according to the nature of their transgressions. In this poem, hell has the organization and efficiency of a bureaucratic state. Every impious soul has its appropriate place, and every place apportioned a particular punishment keyed to a specific sin. More so than any previous author, Dante had a clear and logical understanding of the geography of the afterlife. He depicted hell as a deep funnel with circular tiers. This is a late medieval representation. Here is a modern schematic, which just shows you, if you're not familiar with the poem, it shows you the how well organized and presumably efficient Dante's vision of hell is. It's really quite stunning. Dante and Virgil descend tier by tier from the gates of hell, past the limbo of the virtuous pagans, and down through each circle, where those guilty of lust, gluttony, greed, wrath, heresy, violence, fraud, and treachery suffered for all eternity. Now, I can't think of Dante's Inferno without thinking of the 19th century images created by Gustave Doré. And here are two of my, I'm not sure favorites is the right word, but here are two that are quite again, I don't even know what the words are. They're moving, but in a very sad way. On the left-hand side, you see the wood of the suicides. That is people who have killed themselves, obviously, and therefore committed the sin of murder, where they come back as these hideously deformed trees in a forest that is populated by harpies who continually claw at them and break their branches and give them further torment. Whereas on the right-hand side, we see the soul of poor Bertrand there. This is a part of hell that is given over to those who create divisions in society, and therefore they are all divided. Chief among the people who populate this level of hell is Muhammad, because of the great divisions in religious tradition created by Islam, according to Dante. And that's probably him lying there disemboweled at the feet of Virgil and Dante right there. But Bertrand was an English baron of the 12th century who was accused of fomenting rebellion against Henry II, and therefore he is doomed to wander this layer of hell, his head detached from his body, and he carries it around like a lantern. Again, an incredibly evocative image from Dante's imagination. At the bottom of hell was Cocytus, a vast frozen lake. Trapped in the ice of this lake was a gigantic three-faced Satan who beat his 6 bat-like wings in vain to escape his imprisonment. Satan's face was stained with tears, and his chin dripped with gore from the 3 worst traitors he chewed on endlessly and without pity in his monstrous mouths, because at the bottom of hell, deceit and treachery considered to be the very worst sins. So in the 3 mouths of Satan are Brutus and Cassius, both of whom were involved in the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, and then, of course, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus Christ himself. Now, these long and involved and deeply imaginative and terrifying stories about hell were largely written for the educated elite. Most medieval people would have imagined hell in less elaborate ways than those depicted by the Vision of Tundel or Dante's Inferno. And this is a good summary of what they probably saw in their imagination. The Archangel Michael locking the damned inside of a hellmouth. This was common in public monumental art like stained glass and church sculpture. And this is one of the great inheritances of the Middle Ages, this image. You'll see it everywhere, almost any cathedral in Europe, certainly Gothic, even Romanesque cathedrals, but Gothic cathedrals too. You'll see images just like this one. All right. Well, in 1517, Martin Luther's public protest against the sale of indulgences by the Catholic Church heralded the full-blown critique and rejection of centuries-old Christian traditions known as the Protestant Reformation. Luther's actions had a profound impact on early modern thinking about the afterlife. By the 16th century, Christian doctrine taught that there were at least 5 destinations for the souls of the dead. There's heaven, there's hell, there's purgatory, which becomes church doctrine officially in the 13th century. There's the limbo of infants for unbaptized children who died before they could commit personal sins, but were nonetheless stained by original sin and thus ineligible to enter heaven. This is the place that Pope Benedict XVI recently shut down. And then there's the limbo of the patriarchs for those righteous Jews like Moses who could not enter heaven until the resurrection of Christ. And after the harrowing of hell, in the weekend after between Jesus's death and his resurrection, it now stands empty and has been empty since then. The Protestants reduced the afterlife from 5 places to 2, heaven and hell. They denied the existence of purgatory and the existence of both limbos because there was no direct proof in the Christian scriptures for their existence, and they are correct. Despite these fundamental differences in their beliefs about the afterlife, Protestant thinkers found common ground with their Catholic opponents on the topic of hell. Both camps agreed that hell and its torments were real. Both groups concurred about the function of hell as a punishment for sinners and allowed that divine justice matched the severity of this punishment with the sin in question. Protestant theologians in Europe and their Anglican counterparts in England were far less likely, however, to follow Catholics in their certainty that hell was an actual physical place underground. In 1714, the English clergyman Tobias Swindon went so far as to publish a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Place of Hell, in which he argued uniquely that the sun was the prison of evil souls, because it had the mass to hold the unnumbered damned and the great heat necessary to punish them. Creative guy. While Catholic thinkers ruminated on the cruel varieties of corporal tortures awaiting the wicked, Protestant theologians tended to emphasize the sinner's banishment from God and the wounding of their conscience as the worst aspects of hell. Preaching before King William and Queen Anne in the early 1700s, the Anglican William Dawes, Bishop of Chester and later Archbishop of York, argued that hell was a deterrent to bad behavior that allowed human society to function. Moreover, it had always been so. Every ancient society, from the Israelites to the Muslims, believed in infernal punishment of one kind or another. We shall be hard put to it, he wrote, to give any one instance of a man who has been so far able to shake off his notions and fears of hell, that they should never after haunt and perplex him. Typical of Anglican theologians, Dawes' sermons on hell torments emphasize the absence of God and the lashes of their own guilty minds as the principal suffering awaiting sinners in hell. The undying worm of Christian scripture is no longer a creature that gnaws painfully on the soul, but a metaphor for the sinner's eternal remorse. For their part, Catholics did not abandon their millennium-old traditions about infernal torments. During the 16th century, the Catholic Church staged a counter-reformation to combat Protestant claims about Christian doctrine and to assert that scripture and tradition were equally authoritative in determining religious truth about the afterlife. Moreover, a new monastic order, the Society of Jesus, whose members are called Jesuits, spread the Catholic message about the dangers of hell through their missionary activities around the globe, from Canada to China to Brazil. The Jesuits practiced guided meditation on the passion and death of Christ as a way to cultivate compassion. As novices, they learned techniques of imaginative visualization that allowed them to self-identify with Christ's suffering. They applied these same techniques in their contemplation of the terrors of hell. The spiritual exercises of their founder, Ignatius Loyola, instructed Jesuits to imagine hell with all of their five senses. See in imagination the vast fires and the souls enclosed, as it were, in bodies of fire. Hear the wailing, the howling cries, and blasphemies against Christ our Lord and against his saints. Smell the smoke, the sulfur, the filth, the corruption. These techniques were on full display in a treatise called Hell Open to Christians to Caution Them from Entering into It, 1693, written by the Italian Jesuit Giovanni Pietro Pinamonti. With a startling vividness that recalled Christian visionary literature like the Apocalypse of Paul and the Vision of Tundel, Pinamonti evoked for the sensitive reader the sensory experience of unending torment in hell that stood in marked contrast to the emphasis on the wounded conscience and remorse of the soul, favored by Protestant and Anglican theologians in this period. John Milton's poem, Paradise Lost, written in 1667, is a wedding of traditions of ancient and medieval depictions of hell. The first book of this towering epic finds Satan and his legions of fallen angels recovering from defeat in their war against heaven in a dismal landscape. Quote, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire, a dismal situation waste and wild, a dungeon horrible, on all sides round as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible. The Greco-Roman contours of this landscape emerged in Book 2 of the poem. 4 infernal rivers disgorge into the burning lake their baleful streams, abhorred Styx, sad Acheron, Cocytus, fierce Phlegethon. While far off from these a slow and silent stream lathed the river of oblivion rolls. Right? He's borrowed all these terms from classical antiquity. Encircled by the river Lethe is a hostile landscape. This is the interior of the circle near the lake of fire, where bands of doomed souls wander, quote, through many a dark and dreary vale they pass, and many a region dolorous, over many a frozen, many a fiery alp, rocks, caves, lakes, fens, bogs, dens, and shades of death, a universe of death. Mythological monsters breed in this wasteland, abominable, unutterable, and worse than fables yet have feigned or fear conceived, gorgons and hydras and chimeras dire. Beyond the confines of the river lays, as you can see on the outside where it says cold, frozen continent, is, quote, a frozen continent, dark and wild, beat with perpetual storms of whirlwind and dire hail, where the parching air burns cold and cold performs the effects of fire. Demons known as the Furies ferry damned souls across the lathe to this outer place to suffer, quote, by turns the bitter change of fierce extremes, extremes by change more fierce, from beds of raging fire to starve in ice their soft ethereal warmth, and there to pine immovable in fixed and frozen round periods of time, thence hurried back to fire. You'll remember this is exactly the way that Bede described this contrast between flame and heat, the souls going back and forth, was described by Bede in the 8th century. Unlike age-old traditions situating hell beneath the ground, Milton tells us that Satan and his army fell from heaven through primordial chaos, quote, 9 times the space that measures day and night to mortal men, to reach their prison ordained in utter darkness. Even this staggering distance does not prevent Satan and his minions from their revenge against God, the corruption of the human race. Pre-modern traditions about eternal punishment and hell slipped into decline at the dawn of the modern age. Old certainties about the reality of infernal torments came under attack from 2 different fronts. Secular critiques of Christian doctrines multiplied. Armed with new information about the world gained from advances in the geological sciences and new theories like Darwinism, scholars and scientists called into question the divine authority of the Bible. At the same time, many Christians had a change of heart about hell. Was God an immoral tyrant, they asked, to make human souls suffer such a cruel fate in the afterlife? The late 19th century author Lionel Tollemache thought so. Quote, the wiser among us are seeking to drop hell out of the Bible as quietly and about as logically as we already contrive to disregard the plain text forbidding Christians to go to law and Christian women to plait their hair. Catholic authors held firm, however, to their convictions about the meaning and character of the punitive afterlife. Throughout the 19th century, they produced innumerable treatises, sermons, and poems about the torments awaiting sinners there, confident that hell was necessary as a moral sanction for an increasingly faithless human race. The dread of hell, they argued, encouraged virtuous behavior that directed souls to heaven. Well, the English Catholic priest John Furness stands alone in the history of hell as the only author to have published a treatise on infernal punishment written specifically for children and young persons. Furness organized Christian camps for children in England and wrote religious tracts in simple language directed at young readers to motivate them to cultivate good behavior. His pamphlet, The Sight of Hell, embraced the pre-modern Catholic tradition depicting the suffering of the damned in the most lurid and visceral terms. Praised by church leaders as a work with, quote, a great deal to charm, instruct, and edify our youthful classes, for whose benefit it has been written, modern readers can draw their own conclusions about the merits of a religious tract for young people that depicted the souls of children trapped in burning ovens, forced to stand on red-hot floors, or in one case, condemned for all eternity to wear a bonnet and frock made of hellfire for the sin of showing off a pretty dress. By the late 19th century, belief in the reality of hell was in rapid retreat in the wake of secular and rationalist critiques of age-old Christian doctrines about the horrors contained therein. But the idea of hell has survived in the modern age in the most insidious ways. For 2 millennia, Western Christians believed in the notion that hell was a place apart from the world of the living, a subterranean realm where divine justice meted out punishments to sinners for eternity. But in the decades around 1900, hell found a safe haven in Western culture as an enduring metaphor for conditions of suffering and squalor in this life. During the industrial transformation of England, Friedrich Engels described the filth and debris of urban Manchester as this hell upon earth. In the American South, many condemned, quote, the moral hideousness of child labor that profited the aristocratic stockholders of hell's mills of the South. And while abolitionists decried the cruelty of the hell-concocted system of American slavery. In the 20th century, hell made great advances despite the appearance of its retreat. The Western tradition may have repudiated the idea of hell as an otherworldly place of eternal punishment, but it was ready to internalize hell as a state of mind, as a human condition, and as a guiding principle for interacting with other people. In Jean-Paul Sartre's play, No Exit, from 1944, three hellbound characters unexpectedly find themselves trapped together in a plain drawing room. In the closing lines of the play, the realization hit home. So that is what hell is. I would never have believed it. You remember the fire, the brimstone, the torture? The farce. There's no need for torture. Hell is other people. With the rise of killing technologies that have enabled mass murder and destruction on an unprecedented scale, hell transformed from a passive metaphor to an active inspiration in the devastating wars of the 20th century. From the extermination camps of Eastern Europe to the irradiated ruins of Japanese cities, Christian soldiers, Axis and Allied alike, actualized with merciless detachment many of the hellish scenes of suffering and carnage that had been nurtured in the Western imagination for centuries. By creating hell for other people on earth, they unwittingly became the tormenting demons their ancestors had feared. Theaters of war are not the only cradles of infernal punishment on earth in the 20th century. The conditions of incarceration in modern American prisons, both for criminals and for political detainees, have maximized the suffering of those individuals in an effort to make their lives what we call a living hell. Abandoning God's justice in the world to come, societies have devised prisons with methods of torment as ingenious and cruel as the imagination of any medieval prelate, with one significant difference. In pre-modern thought, God, in his infinite wisdom, dispensed divine justice on sinners in the afterlife. In the modern economy of justice, despite their manifest fallibilities, human beings have assumed the role of divine judge and hellish tormentor, God and demon, to inflict torment on their fellow human beings. But don't worry, it'll all be fine. Thank you very much for listening to my talk today. Much of the material that I'm drawing on here is can be found in the Penguin Book of Hell, published by Penguin Classics. I'm very, very happy to address any questions that you may have. Thank you again for listening.
So there's one question in the chat. Do you know of any cultures who have no conception of hell whatsoever?
So I wish I did. There must be some. I hope there's some. I'll share one with you that you may not know about. I'll say that I'm a specialist in the Western tradition. So, for instance, I did not really go into Islamic notions of hell, which are very much in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I just can't read the Arabic text, so I don't have the same knowledge of that material. And I certainly don't know the Eastern religions very well at all. So those are places to look. But I can say that there's a fascinating exception in the Christian tradition. A 3rd century theologian named Origen of Alexandria, who's writing in Greek in the very last days of the Roman peace. He dies in 255. He writes a work of speculative Christian theology where he attempts to systemize his understanding of scripture and revelation, and he attempts to create a kind of a logical system for how he thinks the Christian afterlife works. And he keeps coming back time and again to a phrase by the Apostle Paul that says, God will be all in all. And he postulates that unlike this whole tradition I've just talked about here, he postulates that that human souls, that all souls, rational souls, were created before time by God, and they lived before time in their worship of God, in their kind of silent contemplation of God's presence. But over time, their love of God cooled, and as they cooled, they drew away from God. And you have to imagine the degree to which they drew away. They enter into a material world is created for them as they receive from God. And those who drew away only a little bit are angels, and those who drew away further are human beings, and those who drew away even further are demons. The one who drew away the furthest is Satan himself. But instead of postulating a single life and then judgment based on what you do in this particular life, Origen had the daring to postulate multiple worlds and multiple ages in which we are allowed to cultivate through our free will and rekindle our love of God. So that over time, many worlds, many ages, he's very vague on this, we will all make our way back to God. We will all rediscover our love and rekindle our love for God. And in the course of doing so, over these many worlds and many ages, we can advance through our free will to become angels, or we can recede through our through bad choices to become demons. But at the end of time, even Satan himself will move back through the ranks of demons and humans and angels to return to his angelic state, and he will be the last one to join God again. So it's a Christian vision of the end times that does not really have a place for permanent eternal suffering, because it's based entirely on this notion that God that free will is what has taken us away from God and causes us to sin, but that God's love trumps everything else, and so we will all return to him. As you can imagine, he was condemned for heresy at the Council of Constantinople in 553, and most of his works were destroyed, and many of them now only exist in Latin translations that were made in the 4th century. So there's even within the Christian tradition, there are models for that think outside this dichotomy of heaven and hell. So that's one answer to a question, but it's an internal one rather than external to this Western tradition. Thank you.
Does the Penguin book include selections from all of the works you've mentioned?
It does. I think almost, except Milton. But you can find Milton online or anywhere, I'm sure there's a Penguin Classic of Milton too. Almost every other text I've mentioned here is translated in this book. Yeah. Does
anyone ever get out of hell?
So in the Christian tradition, no, it's a one-way street. And this is one of the it's a very, very difficult concept for us. In the 4th century, you've probably all heard of Augustine of Hippo, the great bishop of, the saint and the bishop, who lived at the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century. There's an amazing sermon when Augustine used to give sermons at the cathedral I guess it is a cathedral in Carthage. This is the early 5th century. There was almost always a stenographer there who was writing down the sermon. We have dozens and dozens of Augustine sermons thanks to these stenographers. And in one case, after he'd finished a sermon, a family approached him, and the stenographer kept writing because Augustine used their question as a way to give a little mini sermon at the end of his sermon. And the family had approached him and they said, "Look, we have a son who's a catechumen. He's not yet baptized. He's in training to become a Christian, but he has died. What will happen to him?" And Augustine did not waste any time. He began a little mini sermon about this. And you can almost hear him raising his voice as his parishioners are leaving the church. And he says, "Fly while you live so that you may live. Fly to the font of baptism and be baptized." Because without baptism, because then infant baptism was not yet in vogue, right? You had to make a rational choice as an adult to be baptized. But if you die without being baptized, then you go to hell. Your son, his plain answer to them was, "Your son is in hell." This is a really difficult dichotomy just to get your head around, that you are either going to radically change your life through baptism and never sin again, or do your very best not to sin again, change your entire disposition, or face the consequences, right? And the eternal consequences. But we see that by the 6th century, Christian writers are beginning to think of another place. They're beginning to think of a middle ground from which the souls of the dead return to human beings as ghosts and in dreams to beseech human beings for help. They are suffering in the world to come, but with the help of the living, they can make it into heaven. What kind of help? Well, mainly prayer, right? So we pray on their behalf, and we can we petition God to let them into heaven. And this fire that consumes them in this place is called purgatorial. It's not a noun yet, it's an adjective. It's a cleansing fire. But over the course of time, so we are left then with this idea of an afterlife that is ambiguous, right? The really bad people are being sent to hell directly. Really good people go to heaven directly, very few of them. But then Christian thinkers come to create this middle ground, this place where cleansing fire, which is not nice, nonetheless prepares you for heaven. The difference here being that however long you're in the cleansing fire, it could be weeks, it could be years, it could be centuries, millennia, depending on your sins. Nonetheless, it ends and you enter into God's presence forever, right? Whereas hell is forever. But so purgatory certainly by the 12th century has become a kind of an accepted fact. It won't become church doctrine until the 13th century. But it's one of those traditions that grows out of the incredible difficulty that people have in envisioning a black and white afterlife. It's an escape net in many ways. The Protestants condemn it because there's no evidence for it in the scripture, and they're absolutely right. There's no evidence for it there. It is Catholic tradition that grows over time. But Catholics accept that tradition as authoritative. So hell, there's no return. There's no return. And in many of the ghost stories that we have from the Middle Ages and into the early modern period and whatnot, mostly the ghosts who return are returning from purgatory because they're looking for something. They're looking for help. There's no help getting out of hell.
Where does the notion of going to hell because of not accepting Christ, even if you're good, fit in?
So Christians rationalize that too. If you were in the early Middle Ages, if you were an unbeliever, you were just simply beyond the fold. I mean, there were only, in the early Christian tradition, you either had to be a baptized Christian to get into heaven, because that was the only two options, right? Heaven and hell. Or the exception was made for the virtuous Jews. So in the Hebrew scriptures, those Jews who foretold the coming of Christ through prophecy, or through their special relationship with God, be it Aaron, Moses, Isaiah, Ezekiel, whatnot, they were the ones who inhabited the limbo of the patriarchs, waiting for Christ to come. They knew he was coming, according to Christian tradition, and they were waiting for him to come. Everybody else was doomed to hell. Now, Dante introduced something quite new in this when, at the beginning of the Inferno, when he and Virgil start making their way down into hell, very close to the gates where you have the limbo of the unbaptized babies, there's also the limbo of the virtuous pagans. So those pagan authors who, despite the fact that they lived before Christ, nonetheless espoused things that were clearly relevant to the Christian message, or in some other aspects of the literary tradition, they were associated with early Christians. So, for example, the philosopher Seneca was thought to have exchanged letters with the Apostle Paul, and we have this apocryphal correspondence between them. So these kind of pagans were allowed to live in a limbo where they were not being punished because they were virtuous, but they were denied access to the presence of God. So it was it was sad, but it wasn't painful. But otherwise, everybody else is in big trouble. If non-believers, according to from the Christian point of view, non-believers are in big trouble.
Do you have any reflections on why it is that we find these narratives of human agony so fascinating?
Yes, I don't know. I mean, there's a voyeur. There's this. So much of this literature is voyeuristic, but it's deeply didactic. I mean, the attention that is given to the detail in these works is there to warn, to influence behavior. You could call it. I mean, you can say it's didactic in the best possible way, or you can say it's coercive in the worst possible way, depending on what your belief system is. And that's up to the individual believer. I will say that from my point of view, as someone who was raised only very nominally as a Catholic, and I mean so nominally that when I have twin older brothers and our family was nominally Protestant, and when they were asked what religion they were when they were little, they said prostitute. So like really, there was no religious education growing up. And I grew up in a neighborhood in suburban Toronto where there were lots of immigrant Catholic families. So my friends were Ukrainians and Hungarians and Italians who all went to church, who all spoke another language at home. And I was fascinated by both the fact that they could speak other languages, which I couldn't, and also by their devotion to this religion. of course, you know, you only have to be a sensitive individual to realize that even if you're not a Christian or don't consider yourself to be a Christian, Christianity has an enormous influence on the world. And when I went to college, that's one of the things I set out to do. I wanted to understand the role of Christianity in history, in part because it had such a dominant influence on the life of my friends in this neighborhood. And so I come to this as an outsider in many ways. And so I'm fascinated by it, but I'm also, when I read these texts, I'm also appalled by almost the delight that some of the authors take in describing things that are so obviously terrible. And it reaches its height with frankly with Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century theologian I'm no fan of, who rationally deduces that the saints in heaven have full sight of hell and the torments going on there and rejoice in them because they are the product of God's judgment. And that to me is just, I don't know how one rationalizes that. If God is the God of love, I cannot, it seems to be contradictory to me. But I don't tell other people how to think. I'm fascinated by this tradition as a historian of religion and culture, and every opportunity to talk about, one of the takeaways from this talk in some ways is that, you know, hell is touted as being eternal and unchanging. But one of the things I hope you saw today is that hell changes constantly, because it's so many of the cultural products that we have that talk about it are the products of human minds in history. And these minds, whether you believe in the truth value, eternal truth value of it or not, these minds in history tailor hell. But the hell that they tailor is inflected by their fears, by their experiences, not by their hopes, except the hope that they will help you not get there. So that's, I'm sure I've drifted far from the question. I should probably stop and get the next one.
In the Eastern tradition, there is the notion of reincarnation. Is there any such tradition in Western culture? The idea can be appealing. Frankly, the only one I know is Origin of Alexandria, the one I described to you, the sense that we could live multiple lives and live in multiple worlds in the Christian tradition. It's the only one, and it's long since been considered heretical. Now, mind you, French Catholics in the 20th century have done their very best to recuperate Origen's thinking, and there's some really good studies on him now, but almost all of it is in French. But he's got a long way to go. It's a fascinating concept. But no, reincarnation otherwise, no. It's generally speaking, it's one life and then judgment. Over the centuries, have there been serious challenges by authors, philosophers, etc., to the very concept of hell?
There are very few hell deniers in the Western tradition. Again, Origen was one of the very, very few who wrote at that level. No, it's not until the dawn of the modern era that we really begin to see doubt being cast on it. Really, the 19th century is when it comes under attack. But before that, there's almost, you would be very hard pressed to find anybody that didn't believe in hell, who was raised in this tradition. And then almost everybody was. Even in the Inquisition records that I've read of heretical individuals, I mean, they're all heterodox traditions. They're all not part of the mainstream Christian tradition. So there are some dualist aspects of Christian tradition that where hell is not part of their cosmology, but it's not remotely mainstream. I mean, I can talk about it if you're interested, but it's not. It's stuff that turns up in ancient Christianity and then it's revisited again in during the Inquisitions of the later Middle Ages and the early modern period.
Modern secular culture uses hell in much of its entertainment, Halloween, horror films, etc. Why is it so adaptable?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the amazing victories of modern Western culture is that we have domesticated almost every aspect of the past that our ancestors were terrified of. And so I'll start with angels. Angels nowadays are these, saccharine, sentimental, limp figures with, feathery wings. And in the Middle Ages, angels were terrifying,
even up to the 18th century, people thought, they were awful. They made you, they were full of awe, right? And I will say the same for dragons, and even dragons, which we have now fully domesticated. Even the undead we've domesticated, walking corpses can somehow now be, or vampires are a better example, probably. We have vampire love stories and werewolf love stories and blah, 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 right? So it's no surprise that we've defanged the devil as well. And it's one aspect of the slow demolition in the modern consciousness of hell as a real place, that we can make light of it in so many different ways. But as I said at the end of the talk, what I suggested at the end of the talk, its survival as a metaphor is probably much more insidious. But I see that the appropriation of that imagery as being in line with many of the other domestications of once frightful cultural products that we've now kind of made silly and made our own.
Would you expand a bit on the Pope's recent writings about denying hell?
So I will. He didn't write anything about it. And in fact, the Vatican denied the claim. So Pope Francis has this long-standing friendship with this leftist journalist, and they get together every couple of months and have lunch, and they have a kind of free conversation, and the journalist doesn't record the conversations, but after almost every conversation he'll come out and he'll say, "You'll never guess what the Pope told me at lunch today," and then he'll write a report on it, and various people who read the newspaper will say, "Oh my gosh, Pope Francis is saying this and that and whatnot," and the Vatican almost always denies whatever the Pope says. So this in particular caused an uproar. Nobody cared that Benedict XVI shut down the limbo of the infants, or the limbo of the babies. But denying hell is a huge concept, right? And especially this idea of the oblivion of human souls, that the souls of the sinful dead will disappear and be forgotten forever. Is that better or worse than eternal torment? I think I'd take oblivion, but it's up to you. And so this was, this media storm was happening right around the time I was working on the Penguin Book of Hell, which is what brought it to my attention. And but I will tell you that hell deniers are, if you go public with your hell denying, it'll get you in big trouble with certain factions of the church, particularly evangelical factions, who really don't like to hear that.
Scott, I'd like to take advantage of the host's prerogative to
Please
ask the last question. But before I do, I want to say this is a wonderful talk. I'm so proud to be associated with it, even though I was only the host, certainly didn't give the talk. But I mean, I think if they gave awards for lectures and presentations, this certainly deserves one.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you.
Real accomplishment. So we're sort of over time now, but I did want to ask the final question, which is American literature, and probably Anglo-American literature, is full of stories, folktales, and legends where people in all sorts of situations wind up encountering the devil. And for at least a brief period of time in all of these stories, they manage to stump him, to take advantage of him, to render him helpless, at least for a brief period of time. There are so many of these stories, and they seem to be so universal. What does that say to you about human psychology, or the human condition?
Oh, it's a wonderful question, and I've got to tell you, I wish I had it in hand. It's downstairs in my bedroom. I'm reading a wonderful book on this right now. It's called Cloven Country, and it's about the image of the devil in English folklore and landscape, mainly in the 17th and 18th centuries, where the devil really does emerge as almost a kind of inept, farcical villain who is easily duped by regular people. So, for instance, there's a wonderful legend that's told in this book about the devil is walking through the English countryside, and he's carrying a shovel. He's enormous, and so he's carrying this shovel of rocks, giant rocks, and he meets a cobbler who's traveling, or a man on the road who's carrying a little bag, and he's very poorly dressed. And the man says, so where are you going, devil? And the devil says, well, I'm going to go to that town. And I don't quite know, remember where it is, but I'm going to go to the town. I'm going to dump all these giant rocks in the town and kill everyone in the town. And the guy says, you don't want to go to that town because it's so far from here. And he says, see these shoes I'm wearing now, they're almost worn out. And look at this shoe, which is completely worn out, and this shoe, and this shoe. That's how far it'll be. And the devil's like, well, forget it then. I'm not going to bother. And he dumps all the rocks, on the landscape there, and he goes back to hell. And of course, the man is a cobbler who's carrying around a bag of old worn shoes. And he's duped the devil. And it's a way for locals to say, you see that giant outcropping of rocks there? Those are the devil's stones, or the devil's, it's a way of explaining features in the landscape. The devil was also very fond of carrying around rocks and other things in a giant apron skirt. And so it was, the devil's apron is another way to talk about all these things. So I think that the very general answer to your question is that there's according to that book, to Cloven Country, the devil kind of, as the fear of hell kind of erodes in the course of the 18th century and the 19th century, the devil becomes a character in stories of English folklore that once featured witches and giants and other kind of pre-Christian creatures. That's about as far as I can go in terms of an argument. But it's all part and parcel of, the erosion of the seriousness of this belief. That for some reason they grafted the devil onto older stories, and it became a good way to tell a story. I highly recommend the book. It's almost like part travel guide and it's certainly a wonderful work of folklore. If you manage, it's available.
Scott, we're over time now, but
okay. Thank you for the question.
Wrapping things up, I want to thank you. You really did a great job for us. I mean, I'm so glad that we're recording this, and I would like to see it 2 or 3 more times because it was so
you're very kind.
there. So thank you, and I'd like
you.
to thank everyone who attended, and we'll see you soon. So have a good day.
Thank you very much.